Shh. Quiet a second.
Why am I getting that sound? Well, maybe it didn't start yet. That's why.
Hi, Joe. We are giving people, it's Susanna, and we are giving people a chance to join in before we get started. We're going to give it a couple more minutes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Matticio. I'm the director and chief curator at the Blaffer Art Museum. As you entered into the Zoom meeting place, you were watching some video of Stephanie, Jason Lazarus, and Sybren Versteeg's project called Public Address, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. But right now, I just want to offer my thanks for all of you being here and a welcome. And I'm going to just do a few introductions and credits and then hand it off to Stephanie. So first of all, I want to say that this talk is being co-presented with the Moody Center for the Arts at Rice University. We're very, very happy to be partnering with them. And I encourage you to go see the exhibition States of Mind, Art and American Democracy, which will be on view until December 19th, and which has 2 photos by Stephanie in the exhibition. So we're very pleased to be presenting Stephanie's work at both institutions simultaneously. I want to say thank you to Scott and Judy Nyquist, who are our sponsors for public programs around Stephanie's exhibition. And I also want to give thanks to the major exhibition sponsors for Stephanie's show at the Blaffer, which are the National Endowment for the Arts, and then patrons Seth Ammerman, Wanda Kaunachki, Janet Mole-Batani, Tom Schiff, Megan and Paul Seeger, and Carly Wilmans. And also want to give huge thanks to our yearly support, which comes from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Farrell Family Foundation, and many of our Blaffer Art Museum Advisory Board members. And I would be remiss not to give a very sincere and heartfelt thanks to the Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco and Ryan Lee Gallery in New York City, both of whom represent Stephanie, and both have been incredibly supportive and have offered amazing assistance for the realization of this exhibition. So that is the thank yous and the credits, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction to Stephanie, who was born in the Philippines and currently lives in Oakland, California. She received her BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and her MFA from Stanford University. And I'm just going to name a few of the many awards, kind of some of the more recent. She is the recipient of a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a 2020 Tiffany Foundation Award, and she is the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow this year at the National Museum of American History in Washington. Her work's been widely exhibited around the world, including MoMA PS1, the Whitney Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, ZKM, Center for Art and Technology, Camp St. Louis, the 12th Havana Biennale, the 2015 Asian Art Biennial in Taiwan, and many, many others. She is currently an associate professor in sculpture at the University of California, Berkeley, and her exhibition, The Visible Invisible, will be on display at the Blaffer until January 10th, and I very much encourage you to come see it. We are open Wednesdays to Sundays, noon to 5. Admission is always free. And if you come during the week, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, we also have neighboring installations at the Hines College of Architecture and Design, the Honors College, and the Anderson Library, and the Student Center. And those are available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So I want to ask that you all please mute your mics, and please help me welcome Stephanie Syjuco.
Great. Hi, everybody. And Stephen, thank you so much for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. And actually, it's really great because I can see people's faces. I mean, that's amazing. Usually when I'm doing these talks, it's like talking to, a big blank screen. But anyway, it's really wonderful to see familiar faces. I recognize some of you all. But today I wanted to focus, I'll be speaking mostly about works that are included in the exhibition up at the Blaffer. So again, the title of the show is The Visible Invisible, and I'm going to start sharing screen. All right, here we go. Can everybody see this? Give me a nod. Fabulous. Okay. So, well, one thing I want to say is just what a pleasure it's been to work with Stephen as a curator for the Blaffer, because, when he approached me about this exhibition, actually almost a year and a half ago, I think, or maybe even longer, I was visiting Houston to speak at the core program, and we connected to talk about the exhibition. And it was going to be very ambitious, and it is ambitious. It's almost a dozen different projects that are loosely related over the course of 4 years. And so what's up right now is pretty recent work. And when I was trying to put together the talk to go through it, I realized that to speak about all the works would actually be way too much time. So I tried to choose some of the highlights, and we'll go from there. And I'm really interested also in a robust question-answer session. So in a nutshell, I'm titling the talk Insert, Duplicate, Delete on the Politics of Imaging and Representation. And you'll see why, because a lot of the works that I'm showing are really about contested imagery and also contested forms of representation in America right now. Okay, so as some general background, the work that I've been known for, I guess for the last 25 years of my professional artistic career, are large-scale installations. And so there's one large installation at the Blaffer, but prior I've been known for doing installations full of sometimes hundreds or even thousands of objects that have a kind of public access component in some way. So in some cases, the works are people contribute to the production or even the distribution of different objects in the show. I also like to think about my work as it centers around sculpture. So even though it does branch out into lots of territories, and you're going to see, works that deal in photography or textiles and crafts. There's digital new media in the exhibition, and I've been known also for doing social practice and public workshops. So there's a kind of constellation of things, but for me, it all boils down somehow to a kind of very physical presence. I also like to think about how my work exists in multiple spheres. So even though we're looking at work that's specifically in a gallery context, I also see my work existing in a kind of pedagogical sense in the academy or the school or the university, as well as also the larger public. So whether that's my responsibility as a citizen and a kind of like civic participant in the greater community. So the art world is, for me, feels like just one aspect of where I try to focus my attentions. And this is not my work, but I'm using this image to kind of frame what I mean when I talk about the construction of images or the construction of how we represent others in society. And so what we're looking at is a kind of, it's a traditional sort of like photo studio setup that includes a backdrop screen, lights, and all the kind of apparatus that creates the image itself. So these are the things that are usually hidden, and they're not really part of what's photographed, but they're very important, and they're also, they're very physical in a way. And when thinking too about backdrops and the kind of photography studio setup, I'm also really fascinated with how post-production and digital imaging comes into play. And for those of you that are familiar with how images are manipulated today, a lot of it is done through Photoshop or media kinds of manipulations. And the chroma key green backdrop figures in very prominently as both a way for like substituting an image behind what is photographed or videotaped. And then for those that are familiar with digital imaging in Photoshop, there's also this gray and white checkerboard pattern, which is known as the Photoshop transparency layer. And it's the very last layer in a Photoshop file. And you're not supposed to see it, which is kind of amazing considering that it's this very graphic gray and white checkerboard pattern. So where is this all going? I'm using those images as a kind of introduction because the very first works I'm going to talk about are actually the oldest in the series of artworks that are being spotlighted at the Blaffer. And so if we start here as a kind of bookend to where the exhibition ends with the most recent work, I really wanted to just spotlight it because this project called Cargo Cults was the first foray, really, actually, that I did into photography. And so as a sculptor, photography and using images has been very much more a recent kind of development for me. And I think it became more and more important as I started to think about how America itself creates images of who belongs in it, as well as who is considered outside of it, or a visitor, or even an immigrant or a newcomer. So with this series called Cargo Cults, it's black and white photographs in which I'm actually posing for them as a kind of stand-in figure. So these are not at all, self-portraits in any way, but these were made at a artist residency in Omaha, Nebraska. So I was there trying to figure out a way to make work that was interestingly made in the middle of America, but spoke about kind of like global contexts. And for myself, what I decided to do was create these fictitious ethnographic photographs. And so they're black and white, and they look also very graphic and full of pattern. But what I'm doing instead of creating these authentic costumes is I'm going to shopping malls in Omaha, Nebraska, and purchasing, using my credit card, mass-produced clothes and goods from places such as The Gap, Banana Republic, Forever 21, American Apparel, et cetera, I would take those clothes to my studio and then style them in ways that kind of appeared to be these ethnic representations of specifically tribal Filipinos. And after I was done with the photo shoots, I would return the clothes and props back to the store for full credit. So it was this kind of play. It was both humorous, but it was also, you know, a complete construction. Like it was really about sort of performing these fictional identities. And, you know, they kind of, they elaborated themselves in different ways. So the reason I chose these supposedly ethnographic images from the Philippines is because I'm myself from the Philippines. My family, you know, has a background there. And the Philippines also was an American colony. So over 100 years ago, there was this very, you know, strong intersection between the United States and the Philippines. And there's a lot of amnesia around that history as well. The Philippines was also one of the first sort of like countries that the US wound up, you know, colonizing. Well, after the mainland US, of course, but it's, you know, it was one of the first attempts for the US to really see itself as kind of like a global power. So in playing with some of these identities and constructions, you can sort of see, I also had to leave all the price tags on the items. And so if you look really closely at the photographs, you'll see everything from labels to barcodes to actual designer price tags on them. And that was also that I could return them back to the store, you know, to receive credit. And if you dissect some of these images, they're, you know, they also are pretty humorous. Like that's on top of my head is a black cheerleading pom-pom. And then wrapped around my neck are, you know, belts from The Gap. There's a sock from Target around my arm, a USB cord from Radio Shack, and the backdrops are all paper prints that I was printing on a black and white LaserJet printer, taping together and then hanging up behind me, or it was fabric purchased at Joann Fabrics. And so, you know, it looked like this very, you know, kind of exotic, you know, 100-year-old image was actually like purely theatrical. And so the reason too that I was wanting to create these very graphic dissonant images was because I wanted the viewer's eye to be really unsettled. You know, there's this kind of notion too about being able to look fully at an individual and also kind of consume their, you know, what they're presenting to the camera. And I wanted to sort of disrupt that. And you'll also see in some of these images, a kind of interruption of these color scale or like grayscale bars. And these bars are usually used in photographic calibration to determine if a photograph is correct or not. And so with including these interruptions was a very conscious way also to, you know, kind of share that, well, something is not right in this image. And in this particular image, you also see, you can see like a cord coming down from where I'm holding my hand onto the shutter of it. So, you know, the ability to take the photograph myself as opposed to sit for, you know, a fictional photographer who was supposed to kind of capture this ethnographic person. You know, the self-construction of it was also part of it. And along with those images, though, was a bit more of a serious, you know, a kind of bookend. And there was, along with up at the Blaffer right now, along with Cargo Cults, is the series called Applicants, and in parentheses, Migrants. And these are small passport-sized photographs that were taken, you know, using my cell phone camera as a selfie format. And I was thinking a lot too about, you know, in 2016, and this was prior to the election, just prior, there was a lot of, at the time, you know, concern over global migration, both in terms of refugees in Europe as well as, you know, around the world, and especially in the United States. Obviously, that got amplified after 2017 in ways that were incredibly weaponized. But, you know, when I did this project, Migrants, I was thinking a lot about how migrants and refugees were starting to become dehumanized, and also kind of turned into like a faceless mass. The individuality was starting to be lost, and, you know, the larger world was seeing them as a kind of generic group. And so again, using, the similar, kind of format, but also the passport photo, these tiny little images, which are what usually migrants and immigrants need, to produce these photographs to attach to documents as they apply for entry into different ports. And so along with, immediately after that series, in 2016, we obviously had, a big political shift. And what resulted was a series of projects in which I also shifted directions in order to start addressing the effects of what I was seeing as protest in the streets. And, for me, that was really unusual because prior to 2016, 2017, I was really attempting to deal with larger, kind of broader issues of, say, capitalism or globalization or colonialism. And then after 2016, I really switched to dealing with America. And I think that was because I specifically wanted to implicate myself in the construction of an American identity as an immigrant, but also as somebody who really, claims America as a kind of cultural home. And if there are, if we can look in our past and see that a lot has not been resolved because we still keep dealing with it in the present, how can I speak to that as well as also, own up to how I'm also implicated in, the issues. And so Citizens at Ryan Lee Gallery opened in September 2017, and I'd spent 6 months working on it. It consisted of photographs as well as sculptural objects, and the photographs are up at the Blaffer right now. But I'm going to show the larger installation just to give a sense of the context it was originally presented in. These are images, or these are sculptures taken from they're hand sewn out of fabric, and they're put up on steel armatures. And they're literally taken from images of protest signs at UC Berkeley. And so again, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and in early 2017, there was a huge presence of white nationalists and right-wing speakers who were coming to Berkeley specifically to kind of test the limits of free speech. And it was an incredibly polarizing time. It was also just sort of like the tip of the iceberg of what was to come, and what we now, I think, kind of realize is a reality. But in the very beginning of 2017, I think people were still trying to figure out what was happening, or even if what they were seeing was real or not. And so what I was doing with these images is downloading JPEGs of the same protest sign. And so even though these look different, they're actually of the same sign, but taken from different angles, being held at different moments, and held in such a way too that the text on it becomes illegible. So as I reconstructed it and sewed it, I also decided to leave the threads hanging loose as if it was a kind of unfinished project. And it was definitely, it was hard to read because the text on it actually says become ungovernable. And I was interested in this idea that if your political system and those in charge of it start to enact measures that you personally don't believe in, when is the time in which it's appropriate to become ungovernable? And for me too, seeing the text start to kind of almost like melt or become hard to read was another visual metaphor for its inability to be captured, to become ungovernable. And so these signs were held aloft in the gallery, not by people, but by these steel armatures. And the cutouts, you could sort of see at the bottom of the signs, these cutouts, and that's where the heads of the people had been, kind of removed from it. So, literally almost like a green screen effect, like taken out of context and physicalized in the gallery space. Along with those sculptural installations was a series of photographs, which are called Citizens. And these are up at the Blaffer right now. This is Portrait of P. And what these are recreations of protesters that I created with students from UC Berkeley who also attended the protests and were witness to some of the really intense resistance that was happening to the white nationalists on campus. And so, anti-fascist protesters dress in black and specifically to cover themselves up and not be identified. And so what does it mean to take a photograph or try to create a portrait of someone who by their very intention should not be photographed or, you know, should not be identified? And so by working with students, we created a kind of stand-in for what we saw. And they're composites in a way. They're also, they're inventions, but they're also based on, you know, what we experienced and what we saw. And so the students themselves that I decided to work with are parts of groups which were at the time and still are being targeted by the presidential administration. And so these are folks who are immigrants, queer, trans, of color, and those that actually, you know, were in the firing line, really, of some of the policies enacted. And so by working with them to create these, we were able to kind of talk through what it meant to see oneself as a protester. None of the sitters were involved in the actual protests, but we were really trying to kind of grapple with, you know, what their futures would be like moving forward, especially as young people directly affected by these policies. So this is Citizen, Portrait of B. And then as a giant backdrop to that installation was a giant hand-sewn quilt, or, you know, a quilted panel, 13 feet by 26 feet, that was made out of 2-inch by 2-inch squares. And so I wanted to hand construct what would have been a digital background in an attempt to also show that, you know, some of the narratives and the media stories around protest were highly fabricated. It was very frustrating to attend protests and be a part of the dialogue and then go online afterwards and see that the news stories had completely framed it in ways that made, that completely skewed, you know, what folks were protesting against. And so that type of media manipulation was something I wanted to make physical with this type of work. And when you go to the back of the quilt, you also see the kind of the openness of the seams, you know, the threads and, you know, the unfinishedness of the behind, because I did want to expose all the labor for that work. And along with that, with the Citizens exhibition, I wanted to also tie in a kind of, you know, historical precedents for some of the issues that were coming up in 2017 and onwards, which was namely, you know, who gets to claim citizenship and how can it be rescinded? So with the Trump administration's ability to start pulling back on promises for undocumented folks, as well as young people through, you know, the DREAM Act or DACA, there was talk also of, well, of rounding people up. And obviously now we have migrant camps along the border and child separation. And honestly, you know, in pulling together the history of the Japanese Americans in 1942, where over 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps in order to keep the rest of the country safe, you know, that's only 60 years ago, and yet, or I'm sorry, 80 years ago now, but in our recent enough history that it's shocking that this comes up again and that it actually was allowed. And so what I was focusing on in particular is inspiration to create an artwork to respond to this and resuscitate this historical moment was a photo by Dorothea Lange that I found. This was taken in Oakland, California in 1942. The sign says, "I am an American," and it hangs outside of a Japanese American business in downtown Oakland. And he hung this sign up after the notice was put up that he was to vacate and be interned. And so as a kind of protest sign, but also as a way to say to the world that, wait, you know, how is this happening? I belong here. I am an American. It didn't work, obviously, and he had to sell his business. But, you know, bringing that image forward and thinking about it today, I took that sign, I reversed it, so I put white text on black and sewed it into a large textile panel. And one of the original ways it was shown was actually as a room divider. So this project is called I Am Anne. And the word American is actually compressed. And in this particular showing, it's compressed so much that it's difficult to read. And I was thinking about that as a kind of metaphor for the rescinding of the promise of citizenship, the rescinding of the definition of who is an American, and how that can be arbitrary depending on policy. And so this sits in the gallery, and alongside of it is a photograph. This is Total Transparency, portrait of N. And this is a portrait of an undocumented person. And again, thinking about the dilemma of how do you photograph someone who, by being recognized, might be put into danger. This is an undocumented student who I worked with very closely while she was at UC Berkeley, and she had been promised, the college education and also the ability to move forward for a pathway to citizenship. And then all of a sudden, based on the policies put into place, feared for her deportation. And that it's still difficult to talk about, because how that kind of decision can turn on a dime, and having our policies weaponized against people is, it's difficult to portray. And I also wanted to humanize this issue, but not also show her face. And so by covering her with this digital, it's a digitally printed sheer fabric, and the pattern is the Photoshop transparency layer, the layer that's supposed to be invisible. It's a way to, was my way to kind of both protect her, by obscuring her identity, and also to point out this notion that she might be removed or disappeared or made invisible at any minute. So it's a bittersweet image for me, and still resonates for me as being personally powerful. And so along with that work, I also showed, I brought in photographs that did reference and use the Chroma Key green screen. And these are also up at the Blaffer right now. Chroma Key Aftermath, these are reconstructions of the aftermath of protest scenes. So, after attending these protests, usually there's a lot of, they can be very intense. And that's because, there are people that are, bringing to these protests weapons and looking for a fight. And it's the white nationalists are definitely, they have a lot of, what is it? They bring a lot to the scene. So after everything had transpired, the streets were littered with objects. And so whether that's, flags or sticks or barriers or rocks. And so I was recreating these in my studio using green Chroma Key backdrop fabric, as well as painted Chroma Key objects. And again, thinking about how the media narrative of these things is easily and heavily manipulated to serve political purposes. There's two images in relationship to each other. And, again, thinking about, I guess, how American history recurs, or, this notion that we keep needing to rewrite it or relive it in different ways because we've never quite, laid to rest some of the initial problems. I was thinking also a lot about historical reenactment, because the Civil War historical reenactment especially is something that that lives on. It's this attempt to kind of play and replay and put on repeat this battle as if it never really ended. And the more I looked into it, it was super fascinating, because in California also, where there were no battles of the Civil War, there are actually Civil War reenactments that happen in California. And I attended one in Guerneville, California in 2018, which was like super fascinating. Like, why do people invest into it, especially in areas where there is no historical connection? So I also was realizing that, in thinking about the theatricality of these things and the total construction into these narratives, or this retelling of the Civil War, I was looking also at commercial clothing patterns. So many of these are costumes that you can buy off the shelf, and they could be for either stage productions or in some cases actual reenactment productions. And based on this sort of selection of historic, iconic American costumes, I recreated 3 of them using the brilliant green Chroma Key green backdrop fabric. So these are directly sewn from the backdrop fabric. And these were initially showed at the Renwick Gallery, which is a craft gallery at the Smithsonian, and also directly across from the White House. So I spent a year during 2018 handcrafting and hand sewing these based on commercial costumes, but really specifically looking at 3 time periods in American history to highlight. And so one, is the Plymouth Pilgrim on the left, the antebellum South in the middle, which is the very fancy one, and then the Colonial Revolution costume on the right. And using this by hand making these historical garments, I also wanted to implicate myself in the kind of the construction of American history. So, I learned 19th century construction techniques. So everything from really, craft-based ribbon embroidery to crochet lace, as well as bonnet making from scratch. So, historical millinery techniques. And I wanted to go really far into its construction. One, because again, I think we spend a lot of time crafting stories about America. And I mean that, as a metaphor, but also as a kind of like literal storytelling. And they're incredibly embellished and they're incredibly fancy depending on, what we want them to say. And so, the sort of the metaphor of investing that much time was my way of also, plunging into thinking about the embroidery of American history. And so some of these are also very theatrical and costumey. Like, this is not, they're not at all, I guess, authentic. They really are a kind of projection of what, the pilgrim outfit should look like, as well as the, the Colonial Revolution one. And so it's a mix of historical and inauthentic all in one. And so along with that particular work, and granted, all these projects are happening kind of at the same time too. This is Rogue States, originally made for an exhibition at the Moscow Museum of Art in Russia. And it hangs right now on the University of Houston campus. And I think Stephen can share a little bit more about where that is later. But what appears to be this collection of 22 different national flags hangs from the ceiling, almost as if it's a kind of like United Nations style convention. But on closer inspection, it turns out that the flags are actually made from fictional enemy countries from Hollywood and European movies that needed a kind of fake enemy country. So you can see this through this diagram, which is displayed alongside the artwork. These flags, they're reminiscent of everything from like African to South American to Middle Eastern designs, this sort of like vague, international identity. And where they come from, and you can see on this list, as well as this kind of selection here, the list of American movies ranges from the humorous to also, the political drama or, the action movie. And it's, again, it was to kind of like call attention to the construction of, how the United States or the Western world, to a certain extent, needs to invent a sort of enemy other in order to position itself as, the good guy. And whether that goes into the language that's used about, good guys and bad guys, which we've also heard in recent politics, this sort of simplification of, who's at the center of, the shining light in the world, usually positions the United States in the center of it. And by calling it Rogue States, the project also brought into question, like, who really is the rogue state? Is it these fictional others, or is it the country who's claiming to have, all these enemies? So it's a bit of a double-sided title. And so I'm moving on to the inspiration for a project of one of the large installations that's up at the Blaffer right now. I'm sharing, this is an image that I actually stumbled across this old stereo card from 1904 in an antiques shop in Asheville, North Carolina. So I was there, I think in 2017 to do a project, and wandered into an antique shop and found what I thought was this really beautiful image of a woman working on a textile piece from the Philippines. But then the closer I looked at it, the more I realized that there was something very strange about it. It had this sign next to it as if she was on display. And then it was also in 1904. And it turns out that in 1904, there was this, just to back out a little bit more, the stereo card, how it works, it's a kind of early 3D model, or it's an early 3D image. You view it through this viewing system and then it pops into place. And these images were very popular as tourist souvenirs. And so the more I started to put two and two together, I realized that this image was actually generated from the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. And in 1904, St. Louis became the site of one of the largest international fairs to have ever been put on. And it was a chance for America specifically to kind of see itself as a global power. Pavilions were built and great displays of both industry and culture were shown to the public. Millions of people attended, and it was also this very, it also existed as a very strong teaching tool to the American public as to, its kind of place in the world. And along with, the millions of visitors, you were expected to spend almost a week there to take in everything. It was so huge. It was, this amazing spectacle. But along with it was this, the construction of a fake Filipino village in which 1,200 Filipinos were imported into St. Louis to perform their kind of tribal identities to the American public. And again, this took place during the time of America's capture of the Philippines, along with Puerto Rico and Cuba, and after winning the Spanish-American War. So all of a sudden, the United States finds itself with these colonies, and it decides to kind of take it on, but as a way to also start to create its own identity about itself as American and separate from these brown, indigenous, savage people overseas. So what we're looking at is a map of the St. Louis World's Fair. This area here that I'm circling in the arrow is the Filipino Village with the 1,200 people imported into it. And so on display, I'm actually not going to show the photos of direct photos of people on display, because I started to become more interested in intervening in these images that I was finding. So as part of an exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, I spent 2 weeks going through the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, the St. Louis Public Library, and the St. Louis Mercantile Library, looking for ethnographic photographs of Filipinos on display. There's a ton of them. So, there's a huge selection of them. But what I wound up doing was, instead of just straight up rephotographing them, to represent them, I decided to use my own hands and my own body to actually block out people's ability to see the images. And so what results are a series of photographs that shows the entire surrounding of what's being photographed, similar to the studio setup, because these were actually fake constructed villages that the people were then made to perform in and inhabit. So they did operate as a stage set. And also by covering them, it felt to me a little bit like, a century later, intervening into the ability for the viewer to absorb or take in this figure yet again, and maybe even protect them or shield them from that type of consumptive practice. So there's many of these images exist, and looking at the contexts are also really interesting. They wound up being, I chose a selection of them for printing, and they existed in a kind of vitrine. The project is called Block Out the Sun. I was also thinking about how photography relies on the idea of light and light exposure in order to create an image. And so, this notion too of light as being a kind of value of either through education or, you know, shining the light on something, that can also be a form of, in the case of photography, a way to, you know, expose someone to the camera to then have their image be used or consumed in ways that were not their initial intention. So with this vitrine, you're forced to walk around and view it from different angles, and at every moment, your view is blocked. Along with Block Out the Sun, and it's a kind of like two-part. This is the installation that's up at the Blaffer right now. It's called Dodge and Burn, in parentheses, visible storage. And it's a multi-part or multi-object installation that appears to be a kind of museological display, or at least that's how I like to think about it. It's on a platform, and on top of it are different objects and images. Some of them are hand constructed by myself. Others are images downloaded from the internet and then printed onto laser cut wood backdrops. And then others are hand fabricated costumes. So if we go in and start to dissect what's on this platform, there are references here from everything from the turn of the century colonialism or colonization of the Philippines by the United States, as well as contemporary objects. And they all kind of like fold together into this kind of pileup of references and images. And so sifting through it, what I really want people to do is spend time looking and peeking, because there's kind of different things to discover, as well as hidden references. And everything from you know, botanical studies to photographic color calibration charts to traditional Filipino basket weaving patterns to American 19th century coverlet weavings, they're all in there. And I've also thrown in a number of chroma key green objects, and in particular, a number of chroma key green tiki torches that sort of litter the area, as well as chroma key green baseball caps that are reminiscent of, say, mega hats. And so the interruption of the historical narrative of both, you know, kind of dominance and colonialism, and the intersection with more contemporary references is on purpose, because I also wanted to talk about how, you know, these things are conveniently in the past. That, you know, again, we keep kind of resuscitating and reliving notions of racism and inequity simply because they're so ingrained and, you know, in our historical reality. And so, you know, by pulling them forward and really mixing it all up, I wanted to avoid the safety of saying that, you know, the past is past and what we have now is its own, you know, separate contemporary. It's also populated by weird little emojis that I've used to kind of show some more humorous or evaluative judgment moments. So the parts that I don't like, I put the little poo emojis on. There's also, there's everything from, there's stock photos also of tropical fruit, and images of people looking at themselves in the mirror, this kind of like doubling happening. There's also objects downloaded from museum archives and databases. So the Metropolitan Museum's collection of Filipino artifacts has been raided and then reproduced on the platform. There's a floating head in there as well, and it's turned away, and it represents also the American fascination with Filipinos being headhunters. That was like a quite, you know, sort of like aggrandizing, a sensationalist topic that was brought up a lot during the World's Fair. So again, like being able to peek through, there's a lot of people looking and looking back and looking out and regarding each other. Let's see. And so, yeah, here's a selection of objects from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as color calibration charts, skin tone charts, and masks downloaded from Amazon.com, as well as vintage photographs of Filipino revolutionaries. So, you know, this kind of like real cluster fuck of references. And then if you go behind the installation, you can kind of see some of, you know, resistance at hand. So rocks and bricks, painted in chroma key green and, other forms of maybe people rising up against that narrative. And so I'm only showing this image just as to kind of like launch into a related project for the Smithsonian. I really generally don't like to show ethnographic photography, but in particular, this one was taken this is taken during the 1904 World's Fair of a child named Singhua. And Singhua was very popular, an incredibly popular subject, and makes appearances in a lot of photographs for the fair. This is one posed in a studio by the Gerhard sisters in St. Louis. And then I found this other one, which is really interesting. So this is one in which Singhua gets positioned as the photographer. And for me, this is fascinating simply because what happens when, the table is kind of turned, when the entities that are the subjects start to become the structures that construct the images. What type of lens and what type of difference can we see when that's reversed? And so based on this, this kind of discovery and finding of these two versions of Singhua, I embarked on a application, a project for the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, in which I wanted to look for evidence of Filipinos and Filipino-Americans in the photographic archives of the National Museum of American History. Because obviously with the United States' long-standing history with the Philippines, there is a robust presence of the Philippines in their archives. It turns out there isn't. And that itself was really fascinating. So I spent almost 2 months actually in Washington, DC on 2 different trips last year. So the first was October 2019, and the last one was in February, right before COVID hit actually. And so during this time periods, I was basically going through as many of the records as I could in the National Museum of American History. And again, finding hardly anything. It's kind of amazing actually, and what it shows is this sort of historical amnesia. Like it turns out evidence of it doesn't really exist except in, say, military records or military files. And so you can then also see how the larger American culture kind of like values or doesn't value their relationship with the Philippines. But what I did find, which was really interesting actually, are other kind of metaphors, which I'm now pulling forward. So instead of doing work about what I couldn't find, I'm doing work about the margins of the archive. So in particular, I'm really interested in things that are failing to properly convey history, or images that are disintegrating. And this in particular is a disintegrating glass negative from the 1880s. What's also fascinating are images, this is from the database. You can't see the real photograph anymore because it's actually so degraded that this is the digital image that you're allowed to look at. And thinking too about the kind of the blurriness of history and our inability to see clearly, I actually think this image itself, what we're looking at right now on the screen, is more indicative of the kind of, the metaphor of the lens of not being able to see clearly. This actually shows a Filipino guerrilla, a fighter against the United States that has been, that's dead and lying, in a rice field. And again, I also have real conflict about re-showing these types of photographs, but it's the degradation of this image that, I think it brings more to the table. Like we can't see clearly, it seems. As well as also, those specific images about the Philippines, I found a lot of photographs about America that were damaged. And again, I think it's a beautiful metaphor. This is from the Better America series, and it's a slide that's so completely scratched out that you can't clearly see, anything in Better America. There's also really odd files to go through. This is a file of, and the question too of like, well, what do you do with some of these things that you find? This is a file you can see in the middle. It's written in very bubbly letters. It says Ku Klux Klan. And when I opened it up and saw, the items in the file, instead of rephotographing it as evidence in some way, I decided to turn over everything. So they're in reverse, and I photograph it from behind. And so the initial, the images, the messages, everything that was originally conveyed in those files is denied, but it's still there at the same time. Because I think to erase these moments in American history is also a kind of form of amnesia that we shouldn't have. But then the big question is, how do you keep talking about these problematic histories without further resuscitating some of the ideas that we should deal with? So going back into the archives, I was, again, intervening very physically in them. So sometimes stacking up these images, and I'm going to keep running through these to get to the final project. But I'm really, for me, this is turning into a new body of work where, again, the small bits and the margins of the archive are telling more of the story than what the objects that are supposed to be telling the story are actually doing. So, these are the sort of the bits in the file when you open it up and they've fallen out of, the important documents. And what that's been looking like are large scale photographs that I'm blowing up and playing with in different ways. And so very quickly, to tie it back in with the Japanese-American internment, which was the focus of one of my previous projects, the images on the wall that you're seeing here are the backs of photographs that were taken from a Japanese-American family who had donated their family albums to the Smithsonian. And this was a family that had been interned. And so when you turn the photograph over, you realize that it had been ripped out of a black photo book. And in the end, like that kind of material removal and the marks of the removal, for me, are more interesting than re-showing pictures of people's faces or the predicament that they may have been placed in but didn't want to be in. And so again, like, how do we kind of humanely deal with some of the violence and problematics of our historical past? And so I'm trying different display ways that are still being worked out. But lastly, I want to wrap up with so after the excavations in the National Museum of American History, and still trying to process how that's going to move forward, concurrently, I've been working on a collaborative project, and it's co-organized by myself and two other artists, Jason Lazarus and Sybren Versteeg. The project is called Public Address, a nationwide virtual protest, and this is the display, or one of the displays that's currently up at the Blaffer, and then there'll be other viewing areas at different parts of the University of Houston campus. But in a nutshell, the project is it's a digital reconstruction using individual submissions from people who cannot physically attend protests. And so we stitch together their individual submissions to create a kind of live streaming, constantly moving protest in support of Black Lives Matter. And I think more than ever, this type of work is timely because I'm just going to read this because I think it's actually very, I want the language to be very specific. So publicaddress.com. This virtual march asks participants in solidarity with the larger Black Lives Matter movement to protest racist violence, police brutality, institutional racism, and economic violence, while advocating for disability rights, LGBTQ+ rights, Black trans lives, free universal access to quality healthcare, and the expanding intersectional concerns of so many communities. As COVID-19 makes clear, lives are at stake, and the pandemic has only served to highlight and exacerbate long-term inequities, injustice, and violence. We especially invite those who are immunocompromised, people with disabilities, precarious community members, including undocumented individuals or those at risk of deportation, medical workers and caregivers to those who are immunocompromised, those without childcare, those who are housebound, those who are bedbound, and the many other reasons one may need to protest virtually. We are actively prioritizing Black and Brown participants and seek to center them in the work. So Public Address started because originally Jason Lazarus and myself were going to do a series of workshops at the Blaffer to prototype new forms of protest with the public, specifically the student body at the University of Houston. Because of COVID realities, obviously that changed. And along with the rise in Black Lives Matter and the general protests across the United States and also internationally, we tried to come up with a way in which those who could not actively participate could do so. And what we ask of people to be a part of this project is to submit a 5 to 10 second video of themselves holding a protest sign. And again, this is in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but that can be a very intersectional and kind of, an open space in the sense of how much that affects. And so people can submit. We also, we especially highlight submissions from folks who would not ordinarily be able to go out into the streets. And, again, that's for various reasons. In some cases, it's invisible as to why people can't protest. Like immunocompromisation is not always visible. We've had, folks who are bedbound, folks who are in wheelchairs. And along with these images, and I'm going to try to play it here. And we showed this a little bit in the beginning too, so I'm not sure if this is choppy. What happens is we digitally cut them out and we stitch them together. And this is a live algorithm that was programmed by artist Sebren Versteeg. And so Sebren specializes in data, in working with data as an artist. And so he created this live algorithm where new participants can be added and put into this stream, which is constantly changing throughout the day. So it's never the same. You can log onto it right now and you'll see a completely different thing from what you would see at any other time. And so let me forward. So along with this project, we launched it September 1st, along with Black Lives Matter Tampa. And we used it to highlight both what Black Lives Matter Tampa was working on, as well as a platform for them to share over our YouTube stream. So the project isn't just living on screens, but it's a way to be activated in a new light. And I end with that project because it is ongoing, and Stephen's going to share a little bit more too about how we can open it up, or it is opened up to everyone to participate. But I end with this image also to talk about we have just had an election, and there's this idea that things are changing or can change, and yet at the same time, I think what the last 4 years has shown us is that it's incredibly easy to weaponize things that have been in place for centuries, and that is not new in the sense that we've been here before, and we're still there. Protests and movements like Black Lives Matter are still and should always be at the forefront, and that just because elections happen doesn't mean that we should rest. And so, in thinking about the kind of collapse of American ideals, or even this notion of the sort of like the sunny outlook on things, I guess I just want to keep in everyone's minds, this notion that we should always be checking, and that we should always, be thinking about the ways in which there are inequities and injustice. So with that, I'm going to end right here so we can keep talking and open up the discussion. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I think, so I wasn't able to see any of the chat as I'm speaking, and I'm able to see it now, actually. Stephen, how would you like to go about the rest of our time together?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that presentation. I think that Catherine Veneman, our curator of education, she's been scanning the chat, and so she's going to verbalize the questions. So maybe we can start there with the questions that have been posed.
Okay, there have been a lot of conversations in the chat, so that's good. Some are small and some are big. The first question that stood out was that someone asked when we were looking at the stereos images, whether the word stereotype comes from this.
Yeah, that's really good, right? I know, that's a good intersection. So stereo just means two, right? So like, you know, a stereo set, right? And usually that's for audio, also for eyes, 2 eyes. And so, yeah, I actually don't know stereotype. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it probably does have something to do with vision, you know, and the looking. Other than that though, I think that they're not directly related, but I love that intersection, and it's pretty good.
Okay, the next question in here is longer. It was talking about audience. It asked if, who do you think of as the primary audience for your work? It seems as if there are multiple layers of critique that you're crafting, literally and figuratively. I wonder where degrees of your work address, to what degree your work is addressed to audiences who may not typically think about race dimensions of pictorial representation versus audience to whom this work might be read as liberatory and satisfying, possibly righteous in a good way, a critique. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And so again, I guess this is issues of legibility, right, at the heart of that question. Like, so, you know, if the work is about all these different things, like, well, what if, you know, what's legible and to whom at different times? And I guess I'm going to start off with, so cargo cults, right? The photographs I started off with in the beginning that attempted to kind of, you know, critique ethnographic photography. I actually think that in the end was a really problematic body of work, because I was surprised at how many people, and I would watch people as they would view the work. It was up at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I was thrilled to be in that exhibition, but I was surprised at how many people would look at those images and literally not see them as a critique. So they were, you know, I would hear them talk to each other like, wow, that is a beautiful tribeswoman. You know, like they're like, I wonder what village she's from, you know, or they would think it's my village or my background. And I'm like, oh my God, no. And so what I started to realize that as an artist of color in America, whenever you put yourself or your body into your artwork, the larger white audience thinks it's actually about you in some way. You know, that there's this kind of like that we're somehow performing authenticities, or, you know, or always talking about it, you know, to kind of like celebrate it. And so after I did that series, as much as I appreciated what it did, I decided I would never put myself in artwork again. And so if you notice the switch now to looking at America and American history, if Filipinos show up, it's through a lens of a kind of like, it's through the lens of whiteness, actually, or through the lens of like, you know, America framing the Philippine entity as, you know, as separate. And so there's nothing, I'm also very, yeah, I actually say my work is actually not about Filipino identity at all. It's about the American construction of what they see as a Filipino. Those are two totally separate things. And yeah, so again, though, that critique I understand, you know, can be, that's a pretty deep, you know, thought to have, at least what I like to think is. But what I hope is that through the material construction of what I do, so say you walk in and you see the green dresses, you know, and it's like, oh my God, that's a lot of work, you know, and I actually appreciate that, because again, what I'm trying to talk about is the total construction of something, right? So if the work comes across as being like, that took a lot of time to make that really, really fancy. Well, yeah, American history took a lot of time to make really, really fancy, you know? So that to me works as well. So again, I understand that entry into the work can, you know, come from lots of different places.
Okay, there's still a few more. It's a good Q&A. The next one happened, popped up in the chat, I think during public address. And it's, do you think that each square of the Photoshop transparency layers could represent a displaced person that could exist or disappear in accordance to their utilitarian value? And can you extend this idea to the pixels of the archived photographs?
Ooh. Yeah, no, that's a good one. So what I love about our new digital reality is what we have this thing called lossiness. So a lossy image is a compressed image. That's a JPEG. And we're all used to seeing that right now. And I think that, oh gosh, that question's quite large. Let me take it from the idea of the pixel right now. So yes, lots of pixels make up an image. When an image is degraded, so like some of those images I was finding in the archives, which are incredibly low resolution, and yet that's how we're supposed to view our history, I think is beautiful. It's such a good metaphor. We have to fill in the blanks in a lot of cases then, right? Because we can't see clearly. And so that's an interesting challenge. And to the extension, though, that the question talks about, you know, individuals and people, that sounds like a really interesting idea. And I think, you know, I'd love to hear them eventually expand on that, because I think that they've got something there.
Okay, moving on to the next one. What artists have influenced your present work?
Oh, yeah. Oh, goodness. So I think a lot about Paul Chan, the artist Paul Chan, who I absolutely, I love his work for its kind of political acuity. Also, the way he works materially. So, you know, and he designs everything from like fonts to publications to, you know, to video works. And so I think Paul Chan is amazing. I also spend a lot of time now looking at, not quite an artist, but a theoretician, Ariella Azoulay. So Ariella Azoulay writes heavily on photographic theory and colonialism in a way that I think is really super brilliant. So highly recommended. And then also, again, not an artist, but I think is really interesting, forensic architecture, which is, you know, a collaborative group based out of London who works with data to actually create legal arguments in support of human rights. But they were in the last Whitney Biennial, you know, so there's like this really great, they did the Triple Chaser video that exposed Warren Canders's connection to Safariland. Yes, yes.
Okay, and there's one more so far, which is given your interest in crafting in many senses of the word, and also of your use of mass-produced commodities, would you like to address a bit more how you tie economics, capitalism to capitalism to politics of representation and crafting and miscrafting American in quotes narratives?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. Okay, that's pretty large ranging, but I guess if I latch onto the craft question of it, yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to make the connection too about, you know, a crafted narrative, crafted history with a crafted object that, you know, working with your hands can also be a kind of parallel to the construction of stories and headspace. And so I think by pushing, and also by melding it with the digital, right? So that's the other thing too. There's a lot of things that exist in digital space that I've tried to make real again. So if we look at the Dodge and Burn platform project, in which I raided objects from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's database, you know, that could be kind of seen. So the database exists because they have the objects. They've digitized them, put them on there. I take them now, redo it, you know, and remake them and kind of recraft them in this new sort of like object format of this false image. And so, you know, they're very low end images, like they're very low res. So I encourage, if you can go to the Blaffer and you see them, you know, they look incredibly pixelated. And that's on purpose too, because that's the extent to which, you know, I have access to the objects in the collection. And so I sort of feel like I have to accept the low resolution and along with the ability to craft it very well.
Okay, and it looks like one new question has just come in. Your installations have a theatrical element. How would you relate to theater?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it has a lot to do with the photography studio setup. So, you know, if we think about the theater as a kind of traditionally, right, as the construction of space, the construction of, you know, actors or performers, and then, you know, the sort of the viewership or the spectator, a photo studio is kind of similar. You know, there's it's really, both, you know, the photography studio as well as the museum display is a theater set. right? So I actually used to work as a museum exhibition designer at the Exploratorium Museum, which was it's a science museum, but we still were in charge of creating these sort of larger, narratives for the public. And we had a lot of power in how we crafted those things. So, museums again is like a kind of educational tool, as a history lesson, as a sort of repository of knowledge. Those are very theatrical spaces.
Okay, I think that is it. I want to thank everybody, of course, and for asking them. And if there's other discussion elements in here, so I think that sums it up, but there's probably more.
We just got a new question, Catherine, from Benny Ansel, and I'll just read it. It says, in the year 2020, do you find who is your audience to be a loaded question?
I guess it depends on who's asking that question, because sometimes that question comes from people who don't find themselves in my audience, and so they wonder if I care about that or not. So I'm not sure, except that one thing I want to share again is maybe that diagram from one of the beginning of my slides, which had the art world being just one sphere, and then the others being like, the university, the school, also the larger world. And what I didn't share today is actually works that I think I do that are at times anonymous out in the world, in the sense of either whether that's called activist work or whether that's called, service to the community. And so whether, because I'm an artist, there's a tendency to have everything attached to it be somehow artwork. But that's not how I operate. And so, one thing that I want to share too, and again, this is just a sort of aside, was that, for 2 months after the pandemic, I spent working full time sewing masks I made over 1,000 masks to be distributed to organizations that desperately needed them. And that was a free kind of service. And as I was making them, I had a lot of people ask me or want to buy them as artworks. And I thought that was really weird because, this operates on a totally different space. And so again, that's not an audience per se, in terms of the recipient of that work. But I think all of us, hopefully, in whatever ways that we're operating in the world, like we're able to operate on multiple levels, like as a citizen. And I don't mean that as like necessarily like a national citizen, but more as like a civic, responsible, participant in our community. And then as an artist and as, a family person and all these other ways. So yeah, I don't think I answered that question correctly, but I can kind of understand it.
Okay, it's going on.
Okay.
I realized I didn't identify the speakers previously, so I apologize for that. Kiana Q has asked, can you speak a little bit about the flags? Where do you see them standing and who bears them?
Oh, I'm going to assume it's the Rogue States flags that I showed. I love those everywhere. So the fun thing about, Rogue States, right? It almost seems like this like global international community of solidarity and togetherness. And then you find out a little bit more and it's actually a kind of like convention of enemies. And so, I think it's like, it raises all sorts of questions too about nationalism, right? Like flags and nationalism, go hand in hand. And so what is actually being, kind of like touted or promoted by, these entities all gathering together? Like, are we meant to feel proud about that? Or is that frightening in some way? And then let's see. Oh, my flags. That's so funny. Yeah, so I'm in my studio right now. I forgot to even point that out. And it's all a work in progress. And the flags are actually inverted color calibration charts. And so these are the standard color calibration charts to correct photographic images, but they've been color inverted. And then there's a kind of campaign happening that I can't yet figure out what's going to happen, but there's definitely a war going on or like a battle of some kind. And then I guess the last question I'll share, and that's for Matt. What advice can you give to young Filipino artists? Thanks for asking that, Matt. Yes. Yeah, so I guess like this is part of a larger discussion that I like to have sometimes with other Filipino artists, but it's really like to be as complicated as possible. And I know that sounds so weird, but it's because like the demands to represent your identity in a very sort of like narrow way is so like, it's the easiest path, right? It's like everyone wants the recognizable things to celebrate, you know, ethnicity or identity. And while we should celebrate those, I think we should also be very cautious about how that conscripts us into only staying within that, you know, field or track, or like, you know, not everything needs to be legible either, because, you know, I can make work about being Filipino or having Filipino references, and yet there's no brown bodies in it, or there's no food references, or there's no like textiles. Just hate to say, you know, but that's like, why do these concerns somehow need to come with like symbols that are legible, you know, to mostly a non-Filipino audience? So be very complicated and be contradictory in your artwork. Just let it all, you know, fly. But anyway, that was really, thank you so much for the wonderful selection of questions, and I really appreciate the attention. So thanks for being here tonight.
Yes, I want to thank you all as well. I know there are still questions coming in, but it's probably a good time to wrap. But I just really want to thank everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Stephanie, as always, for giving such a generous and insightful and perceptive presentation and talk. And just want to, again, invite all of you to come and see the exhibition in person. You know, the Blaffer has a whole series of safety protocols, so we give you a safe experience, but really to experience this work in person, you know, is the ideal scenario. So thank you again. Please stay tuned. There is another public program in the works. I can't say too much about it at this point, but mark your calendars for January 6th, where the Blaffer is going to be collaborating with the Asia Society Texas and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft with a panel discussion in which Stephanie will be involved. So just to put that on your radar, and to thank you again. Thank you again for being here this evening.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Take care. See you in the world.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Mom. Mom's here. Bye, Mom. I love you.
Love you too.
All right. Bye, everyone.